island settlements and the cultures that develop from them grant us the rare opportunity to watch man as a pioneer and builder. They raise so many interesting questions, such as, what is it that has driven man at various points in ancient history to leave the mainland home and take to the seas? This sort of question deepens when we try for a moment to imagine how this would have been experienced to them. A young man in the Lapita horizon, for example, who has been acquainted with the terrible storms off the coasts. He has looked out at the ocean throughout his life, the thundering of the heavens, the flashes of terrible lightning in the horizon which seem to stretch infinitely, the crashing of the waves which seem to assault the coast. And there are perhaps moments in our own lives where we catch a glimpse of what this sensation would have been like. But in the modern day, we take for granted a knowledge of geography. We know looking out from Montauk Beach that Europe lies far east, and just knowing that basic fact provides a vague sense of security. But this Neolithic man who gazed out at the horizon, it would have been seen as infinite, unknowable, and terrible in the ultimate sense of the word. And yet despite this, some impulse has driven man to accept the challenge presented by these distant islandscapes, to make landfall and graft onto these lands the mark of their character. It's as if they are petri dishes, enabling us to ask rare questions such as, what happens when man, established on the mainland, traverses the seas to settle on distant islands? How does he make his world? How do the islands themselves and their unique configurations influence movement, trade, or culture, and even in a higher sense, the very cosmology of the settled peoples? To what extent does man make the islands, and to what extent do the islands make the man? And most importantly for our purposes, what did he take with him from his original mainland home? When we think about ancient Greece during the Bronze Age, Troy comes to mind. The grand citadel of Mycenae with its imposing Lion's Gate relief and those massive ashlar walls still standing to this day. An aristocratic culture centered around martial prowess of Achilles and Hector and their climactic battle. But these Mycenaeans, they were not the only Bronze Age culture of the Greek past. In fact, they were latecomers. The culture I'm speaking of predates these Mycenaeans by more than 1,000 years. Before one could ever talk about Mycenae or Knossos and their massive palaces, the islanders of the Cyclades had a cultural legacy of their own. A legacy that shaped the later life of ancient Greece in subtle but profound ways. Ways that are only recently coming to light because a long history of looting has damaged context over the years. Despite this, scholars over the past few decades have managed to put together a coherent chronology of these island culture developments. The period that concerns this video is that which stretches from the distant Neolithic to the so-called Early Bronze II phase. This Early Bronze II period between 2700 to 2300 BC saw the prominence of what has been called the Kiros-Syros culture. This so-called Kiros-Syros phase is considered the height of the early Bronze Age in the Cycladic Islands. You are probably familiar with these strange sculptures. They are generally known as Cycladic folded arm figurines. Most have this general schematic, and they have been found in massive quantities throughout this period, but they had some variations in form, as you can see here. Certain islands seem to have their own take on this general schematic. Take for instance this figurine here, the harp player. He sits on an elaborate chair, plucking the strings of an instrument. Most interesting is this motif that sits on the frame, what appears to be a duck or a swan bill. This is not the only harp player either. As you can see, many of these figurines have been found and all of them appear to have this swan bill. Needless to say, we are stumped as to what function these figurines had. We do not know their purpose, how they were used or why, or what they represented in a religious sense. No written records survive that could ever tell us either. Our contemporaries are satisfied with ascribing to them some sort of fertility symbolism, given the fact that most appear to be female with breasts, their hands placed over presumably their pregnant bellies, hence the folded arm posture. But we must admit that fertility is very vague, and this word is becoming increasingly unsatisfactory as an explanation, because this same symbolic meaning is also ascribed to these strange objects, found in this same Kiros-Syros period, at what have been called frying pans. These, of course, were not actually used for cooking. The pubic triangle, so commonly featured, also hints at some sort of fertility symbolism or function, yet here too, despite the massive quantities that have been found all over the islands during this period, we have not the slightest idea what they really are. The first indication that something is off is the simple fact that fertility is used to explain a whole host of ancient artifacts all around the world. This hints that there is something in our mentality and attitudes today that effectively block us from seeing beneath the surface appearance of these objects. It should be a simple matter of fact that the Cycladic islanders would not have vaguely understood their objects as fertility tokens. No, the way in which these objects were treated, the context they were found, they all show a rather long and sophisticated tradition. So when archaeologists say that it was likely some sort of fertility symbolism, but their function, how they were used, eludes us, that is an articulation of this sense that what these objects represented to the Cycladic islanders had far more depth than our mental horizon is picking up on. So we ascribe to it a fertility symbolism without truly understanding what it is about this particular expression of fertility that was so meaningful to these people. Archaeologists are very concerned with this elusive why, but it's becoming increasingly clear that we do not even have the vocabulary to receive a proper answer. As if we shoot out arrows, hoping they will land at our desired target, but the target itself does not want to hold our shot. Those arrows we send out seem to dissolve at this threshold between language and symbol. By the end of this study, I hope to arrive at a much deeper understanding of the Cycladic islanders of the Bronze Age and the true nature of these objects, as well as provide an interpretive framework capable of doing so. For it is through symbolism and religious expression that we get a glimpse of something far beyond the material record, something that instead touches on the mentality, sentiments, and experience of ancient man. And that is the central premise of this video, that symbols, in a general sense, are alive. They correspond to a sacred idea or concept, and although the idea oftentimes eludes us, being separated by millenniums of historic change, the symbol captures it in some way. In other words, symbols can be somewhat of a portal to a different view of the world if it is approached in the proper way. To brush against the true depth of a symbol is to step closer toward the mind of the ancients, to momentarily inhabit their way of seeing, feeling, and understanding the world. The methodologies employed in Cycladic research have undergone many changes. The islands are interesting in terms of their ancient history as much as they are theaters in which the history of archaeological research itself has played out, and all of this will be looked at. But the ultimate goal is to resolve these differences into one coherent view of the Cyclades. We will be focusing on the harp player, as if this musician represents a focus point in which the following considerations may revolve around. This figurine has been chosen because it represents one of the heights of this Kyros-Syros culture, the consolidation and culmination of many symbolic elements in the long history of their story. And we will try, as much as such a thing is possible, to see if we can hear his song. It may be wondered why these islands in particular fall under the designation of Cyclades to begin with. After all, there are some islands in this Aegean region that don't fall into that category. We have the northern and then the southern Sporades, for example, but also the Dodecanese and Crete. The reason for this is because the term Cyclades is cosmologically grounded in later Greek mythology. These islands were believed to encircle Delos, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. And in times of lower sea levels, many of the islands belong to one land bridge. Some early hominid activity has been detected as a result, but human history as we know it in the Cyclades doesn't really begin until the Neolithic, and even then, the later phases of the Neolithic. We do not know exactly how or why these islands were colonized, or if the term colonization is even adequate in this context. The word beckons to mind some image of a coordinated effort, similar to the Greek colonization movements of the 8th century, when the oracle would inform them of new lands to colonize and a large force would be sent out for this project. This does not seem to be the case with the early Cyclades. It seems more likely that this process happened over the course of centuries and various ebbs and flows. We can imagine a first contact, a survey of the island's resources, the reporting back to the mainland settlement, and then a back and forth traversal for resources. Perhaps as this pattern became more familiar, outposts would be established on these islands for more permanent workforce. Maybe disaster would disrupt these movements here and there. Many scenarios come to mind, but the point is to emphasize that this must have been a very long and dynamic process rather than one coordinated colonization campaign. The resources offered on these islands must have been a very attractive prospect for the coastal settlements around them. Melos, for example, had a massive amount of obsidian, an immensely important resource in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. In the late Neolithic period, right between 5000 to 4500 BC, we see the first remains of permanent habitation on these islands. Right here, off the coast of Paros, on a small islet known as Antiparos, a large village settlement once thrived that we call Saliagos. Now, Saliagos is the name given to this particular settlement, but the material found here has also been found at other island settlements of the same period. Hence, we call these assemblages the Saliagos culture group. This is the type of material found at these sites. Spindle whorls, obsidian blades, this distinctive white painted pottery, and figurines that have a fiddle-like shape. After the Saliagos cultural group, we see the rise of something quite different. In the northwest Cyclades, on the island of Key over here, remains of a cemetery were found dated in the final Neolithic of 4500 to 4200 BC, a few centuries after Saliagos. To date, it is the only cephaloculture site that has been fully excavated, and the findings suggest that these islanders preferred open settlements on the coast. This cemetery had 35 graves built as simple cists with what appear to be family groups inside. These red burnished pottery sherds here are typical of this cephalo group, and they are also found all over Attica on the mainland. To better conceptualize these groups, here is a map of what you've been looking at. Saliagos sites are in white, Kefla sites are in black. And if we zoom into the island of Andros, we become acquainted with another Phino-Neolithic site called Strophilos. What is most interesting about this settlement is the elaborate fortification wall constructed, which was virtually unknown even in later Bronze Age periods of the Cyclades. And if we look at the actual stones, we see that our ancient denizens of Strophilos left for us these carvings, some of the earliest works of art in Europe. Bowls, cups, obsidian blades, spindle whorls, these are objects born out of utility and necessity. But these are impressions of ancient man's soul, and through these sorts of carvings we get a small glimpse into their world. What happens after the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age is quite mysterious. We know that the large village model of the Saliagos culture was abandoned in favor of much smaller hamlets consisting of one, maybe two family groups. These small hamlets were situated on coasts and only inhabited for maybe 1 or 2 generations and then seemed to be abandoned. We are now in the first period of the early Bronze Age, and this new way of island living left for us these assemblages, the Grata Pylos culture group. But we ask, why did this change occur? For it appears at first glance like a regression. We have this thriving large Saliagos village model that slowly waned into an almost nomadic style of island living, with crude wattle and daub hamlets that weren't built to last. Cyprian Broodbank, in his Island Archaeology of the Cyclades, wrote at length about the possible mechanisms behind this shift. He pointed out that the Saliagos village model, with its sedentary character and large population, must have been a very risky enterprise, for if some natural catastrophe like famine struck one of the breadbasket islands, it would spell devastation for the entire village. To put it crudely, the villages of the Saliagos period were man putting his eggs into one basket. But the islands are unforgiving. They are dry and arid, with only a few islands suitable for agriculture. There was not much natural game, nor is there an abundant supply of timber. The waters themselves are turbulent, with only a few times in a year where winds and currents were favorable for long voyages. Storms are frequent, and there is an immense amount of tectonic activity in the Aegean. The Thera volcano would erupt many centuries later, and even today, Santorini is hit with frequent earthquakes. In other words, when the question was posed earlier, to what extent does man make the islands? To what extent do the islands make the man? It seems we have an answer. When man initially traversed those waters, he imported his way of living on the islands. He followed the logic of mainland living, nucleated, agrarian, village-centered settlements. He was still getting his bearings, understanding how to master sea navigation and island life, but the Aegean would not bend easily. It demanded a new type of man, and he had to rewire everything he knew over the centuries, and over time, the islands weathered those social structures that had maintained his survival on the mainland so successfully. They forced him to adapt and to conform to their nature, and so over time, the large nucleated village of Saliagos receded. People, family groups, they dispersed throughout the Cycladic islandscapes, and Grada Pylos man learned to live in harmony with them. Settlement became adaptive and flexible, attuned to the rhythm of the sea rather than the permanence of fields and walls. We cannot underestimate the spatial dimension of this experience, for this Cycladic spatial consciousness now permeated every aspect of their life. We take for granted that now we can conceptualize an aerial view of these islands and seem to view them as separate patches of isolated land in the middle of the Aegean. But ancient man did not conceptualize an aerial view of the Cyclades. He lived it horizontally, moment by moment, with peaks and coastal bluffs and dynamic currents forming a navigational matrix that he learned to master. The sea was no longer a barrier, it was his highway, the connective tissue between islandscapes, and that word, islandscape, that is the proper way to view this Cycladic perception from here on out. The islands were nodes in a wide connective maritime network, and perhaps the distinction between land and sea blurred over time, for he had made both his home. Mount Zas on the island of Naxos, it cuts the island rather neatly in half, and those viewing from the south are confronted not with Naxos as an island, but Zas as a looming barrier that hems in the northern horizon. So it is no surprise that this mountain took on a sacred aura, with archaeological evidence showing that it was a significant site of ritual activity from the Neolithic onward. This Grada Pylos phase of the Cyclades lasted from 3200 to 2700 BC, and sites have yielded this repertoire of material: the marble candela, the pixies, the collared jar, and these fiddle-shaped figurines again. Let's take a closer look at them, for we are looking at one of the precursor forms of the later Cycladic figurines, and in the same way, we do not know what these are. They have continuity with that Saliagos culture, but they've also been found in massive quantities in sites further south and east in the Levant. At one of these sites called Galat, 60 of these fiddle-shaped figurines were found in a religious context. These predate the Cycladic fiddle figurines by at least 1,000 years, and these Levantine people that fashioned them were capable of sculpting more naturalistic features, which means that this abstract rendering was deeply intentional, and by the time they arrived in the Cyclades, they already had a very long tradition. Zooming back out to the Grada Pylos phase as a whole, it's clear that the small size of these communities meant that networks of trade were vital to survival. So for several centuries, the Cycladic islanders established these ties in earnest, and long-range voyaging really took off. And later in the period, in a sort of transitional phase, we begin to see these sorts of objects, the so-called Campos group. And within this material group are the mysterious frying pans. Archaeologists have been trying to understand what these strange objects are for decades. They all conform to the same general form, but some of them have a different prong appendage. Some of them have stars and sun motifs. Some of them have depictions of boats with running spirals symbolizing water or air. Some of them are as wide as 11 inches, others only 2 to 3. Some have theorized they were lids, but no containers have been found that would hold them. Over here in Euboea, in a site called Manica, a massive graveyard was found and the frying pans had no designs at all. Over here at Kyros, south of Naxos, the frying pans were made of marble and do not appear to be decorated. Whatever these objects were, we see quite a lot of variation. And now, finally, beginning around 2700 BC, we arrive at the true subject of our study, the Kyros-Syros culture of the early Cycladic II period. This is the high point of Cycladic culture, when a sort of pan-Cycladic consciousness had blossomed. Man had tamed the islands and the islands had tamed him. The networks that had been culminating in prior periods reached their height during this time, and this Kyros-Syros culture group seems to have spanned the Cycladic archipelago, pulling many other Aegean elements into their center of gravity. All sorts of objects, both from abroad and manufactured domestically, sprout up during this time, and the settlements themselves were generally better planned and constructed. And it is in this period that the famous Cycladic figurines emerged. One can't deny, looking at these objects, that there is something almost modern about them. The minimalism of the features and form, the shiny crystalline marble, they seem to appeal to our modern tastes in a rather strange way. And it's because of this that when they begin to see the light of day in the early 20th century, their discovery sparked a massive looting spree all over the Greek islands. Artists like Picasso were fascinated by these sculptures, and over the decades, countless settlements and cemeteries have been upended in this gold rush of illegal excavations. Wealthy art collectors wanted authentic Cycladia, and illegal antiquities markets began to be flooded with them. If that's not enough to complicate the picture, the demand for these also led to many forgeries, many of which are still proudly displayed in the museums around the world. One particularly devastating looting spree took place on a very small island of Kyros, just south of Naxos. This particular region on the coast of Kyros Island, named Kavos, is one still shrouded in mystery because of this looting. The looters targeted this particular area, now called the Special Deposit North, and it is called this because this particular zone held hundreds of these Cycladic figurines. What is most strange about this so-called Kyros hoard, which hit antiquities markets in the 60s, is that they seem to be deliberately broken. There were almost no intact figurines, and the durability of the marble means that this surely wasn't an accident. Archaeologists were actually astounded by this fact and were not sure what to make of it, for the possibility remained that they were destroyed in the looting process. But when Colin Renfrew returned to Kyros, opened up another trench, Special Deposit South, they found hundreds more of them, and once again, all deliberately broken. Now, over here is a small islet, about 100 meters across, called Daskaleo, where other domestic remains have been found. The pyramid-like shape of this island must have been an imposing landmark, especially with its settlement that followed a terrace design in line with the island's prominent form. If we couple these considerations with the fact that the marble used to fashion these figurines does not come from Daskaleo or Kyros, but from other islands like Naxos, then we seem to be looking at the spiritual epicenter of this Kyros-Syros culture group. Because even the building materials didn't come from here, it came from the neighboring islands. It is by far the largest prehistoric marine transport operation that has ever come to light anywhere in the world, Julian Wright. 10,000 tons of solid marble were transported on boats from Naxos, which would have taken about 3,500 trips. And that is how the site is interpreted today. This site was some sort of island sanctuary, and these broken figurines are the remnants of some sort of lost ritual activity that took place here. So, despite the destruction that took place all over the Cyclades through looting, researchers have put together this neat chronology of developments. But chronologizing, of course, is not understanding, and despite all of the information that has come to light in just the past few decades, one stubborn question remained unanswered. Why here? Why did the epicenter of this Kyros-Syros culture seem to be centered around this very specific area? Because the Kyros-Syros culture comes to a rather quick end around 2000 BC, and these small islets to this day have remained uninhabited. And there is no reason that they would be. There is very little space for an expansive village, very little resources or arable land or pasturage for livestock. Yet for some reason, the Cycladic Islanders seem to have made this Daskaleo Kavos complex the axis of their spiritual life and expended monumental effort to accomplish this. Cyprian Broodbank in 2001 stepped up to the challenge with a fascinating technique. He based this off of techniques employed in the Pacific Islands, which use what is called a proximal point analysis to model population growth on islands. The goal of this technique is to model where networks between islands are most likely to form based on the layout of an island system, and this is how it works. You start with dots, which represent possible settlements or population clusters. The number of dots each island receives is based on the size of that particular island, so small ones like Astafalia only get 1, but Naxos over here gets 3 or 4. Keep in mind that these dots do not represent actual settlements that have been found, they are modeling probability. And what Broodbank did was create 4 different proximal point models. In each succeeding model, the dots of each island increase, which is meant to model population growth as time goes on. Networks then form based on these dots. As population increases, so do the dots, and so do the network potentials between the dots. This first model represents Neolithic population densities, while the second reflects Grata Pylos populations. The final 2 represent varying levels of Kiros-Syros population numbers. Through this interesting model, we see that these small island groups, which include Dastkaleo-Kavos that we looked at, form the highest level of network connections and seem to facilitate these connections just by virtue of location. This technique may not tell us what exactly took place at Kavos, but it can at least get us engaging with the problem in a unique way. However, there is one modification to Broodbank's model that will be presented, an objection that may get us even closer to the heart of the subject. The contention raised through this new model is not on the merit of the technique itself, but its lack of continuity with what Broodbank and others have established, that in Neolithic times there were certainly 2 favorable axes of entry into the Cyclades from the first colonizers, one from the northwest and one from the southeast as shown in this figure. Naturally, it follows that these would therefore represent 2 distinct peoples whose ways of living originally differed in ways that would be very difficult to quantify. Nevertheless, this difficulty should not lead to the assumption that this is a trivial distinction. Even at a most basic level, how are we to understand these islanders unless we consider where they came from and what they may have brought with them? So Broodbank's model will be adjusted slightly for the express purpose of identifying the convergences of 2 distinct groups arriving from different directions. First, take a look at this figure here, which shows early mechanisms for how this northwest group jumped from island to island in the Neolithic period. The very way these islands in the northwest are configured almost invite this particular trajectory, and if we also account for the fact that Neolithic canoes couldn't brace the seas for much longer than 10 kilometers round trip, then this particular route would be an attractive one for our early Neolithic adventurers. Now, if we look in the southeast region of the Cyclades, we see that the coast of Asia Minor affords a very complicated mass of islets in which several different directions could be taken. We can imagine one that curves north, arriving through Ikaria, where Mykonos would be favorable, and we do see Saliago's culture sites there. We can imagine more risky endeavors like this one, getting to Astaphalia. For our purposes, it's enough to put as their initial jump off on the island of Astaphalia here. So to begin, we will keep Broodbank's placement of the dots basically the same in each model. What will be done differently is this. The southeast group will be represented by the color blue, and this northwest group will be represented as green. In this first model, we will weigh the likelihood of the same colored nodes linking against the likelihood of different colored nodes joining, taking as a basic law of migrations that in pioneering endeavors, man will generally rely on his immediate community. He will rely on his coastal mainland home until he becomes self-sufficient, or at least the trail of settlements left in his people's wake. And we will model this in the following way. If there is a place where a green and a blue node can connect in this first model, it will only join if the 2 points lie within a 10-kilometer canoe distance. In the following simulations, the color orange will represent points of contact and cultural diffusion. When 2 colored nodes join, the node then becomes orange, and then from these orange nodes, 2 dotted lines will emerge as if trying to connect to other nodes. This is meant to simulate not just network formations like Broodbanks, but also model a mechanism of cultural diffusion. And when we play it out together, the model looks something like this. We see that by model 3 and 4, the orange synthesis color has now completely enveloped the Dastkaleo-Kavos islets, as well as southern Naxos. We also see that the northwest islands remain relatively insular, though not completely so. Syros in particular, which holds a massive site called Kalandriani, remains firmly tied to this northwest group just due to the natural layout of these islands. To be cautious, these 2 distinct groups will not be named, but will be referred to as the Northwest and Southeast group respectively. It may be tempting to attribute them to the Pelasgian people in the Northwest and Luwian or Proto-Carian in the Southeast, as tradition would have us think. but the possibility that other groups intervened must be left open. The labels are meant to approximate a general collection of people, but the point of this model is ultimately to show how the unique configuration of these islandscapes seem to facilitate certain networks and synthesis just by virtue of location. Some seem destined to remain insular, while others invite wider participation. So we have this adapted model, but can anything useful be derived from it? Well, as it turns out, there are several important observations from this that seem to square away many strange asymmetries that current research has only been discerning in passing, facts that are treated as rather insignificant and random. One of these is that Calandriani on Syros has many corbelled-style tombs, and these have no equivalent on any of these southeast islands. They are unique to this island of Syros. Additionally, there are many stamped and incised pedestal jars found at Calandriani and found all over the mainland, but they are very rare in the southeast. And despite Calandriani's massive quantity of burials, the Cycladic figurines are a rarity. Only a few of them have been found up here in contrast to the hordes found at Kyros. If that's not enough, many of the so-called frying pans have depictions of longboats, but these types with longboats are only found at Calandriani. It seems to explain why the epicenter of Pan-Cycladic development exploded in this Naxos-Aromonian region, with their influence spreading as far as Agia Photia on Crete, while in the case of settlements in the northwest, like Agia Irini on Key, the settlement architecture and local ceramic repertoire find their best parallels in eastern Attica, with Cycladic imports from further south standing out immediately. It is striking that no fortification walls were constructed in this southeast group until after early Cycladic II, while Strophilos, Agia Irini, and later Castri come to mind in the northwest. Far from being arbitrary, these small changes to the model suggest that we may examine actual Neolithic and early Bronze Age developments with fresh eyes. Returning to our map of Saliagos settlements, it appears that it may be the handiwork of this initial southeast group of colonizers. And the lack of Saliagos diagnostics in the Northwest Islands is strangely lacking if one has gotten used to the strict chronological designations of prevailing methods which see only material. This Kefala culture of the Northwest then must correspond to a different group of islanders who would have had their own motivations, culture, and iconography. And given the final Neolithic dating of these Kefala sites, it stands to reason that what was taking place was a later wave of island colonizers coming from the coasts of Attica or Euboea at a time when the Saliagos village model was receding into the adaptive Grottopilos style of living. And there is plenty of evidence of this continuity between Saliagos and the Grottopilos culture groups. Zos Cave in Naxos shows this clearly. The lowest stratum has Saliagos material, but is then succeeded by later strata with patterned burnished pottery. And this pottery is contemporary with Kefla culture, but is physically distinct, as if the two groups were playing with the styles of one another. Cheese pots with a red burnished look similar to Kefla culture, but with a Grottopilos style pedestal were found on Naxos, once again reflecting this gradual synthesis. So it seems even in the Neolithic, these northwest and southeast groups were making frequent contact and adopting methods of craft from each other. Emphasizing this northwest and southeast distinction doesn't imply a complete isolation in early periods, for the entire point of this approach is to show that Kyros-Syros culture represents a high peak in the development of both of these cultures and their resulting interaction and synthesis. And if we look at a map of Grottopilos sites in early Cycladic I, it once again conforms to our model. It seems that Grottopilos is an extension of these southeast islanders who were beginning to incorporate other elements through long-range travel and trade. And as these networks started to develop, so did its contact with this northwest island group. Our modified model indicates that by the fourth, roughly corresponding to estimated early Cycladic II populations, a chain reaction of cultural and artistic diffusions had enveloped the Naxos-Aromonian region. Over the many centuries, their mainland ties waned, and we see in the third model what possible islands acted as intermediary facilitators of this interaction. We now have an original lens from which we can view the ancient history of the Cyclades. We have seen that this Kyros-Syros culture designation may actually be imprecise, for it implies that the entire Cycladic networks were equally involved in the material output that has come into our catalogs and records, equally involved in the culture we can detect with our spades and microscopes. But as we've seen, there are many asymmetries and subtleties that have gone relatively unnoticed, and this is not to say that no archaeologist has ever pointed out regional variation, but through this model we have an explanation for degrees of variation. These culture groups must be viewed with the proper level of dynamism and flexibility. It is not enough to say Calandriani had a few figurines, therefore it is just as much a part of this Kyros-Syros culture as the other island settlements, for it is clear now that what we are looking at are clearly separate developments that surely collided and interacted and synthesized over the vast expanse of time, but that ultimately had a distinct destiny, a distinct spirit. If the key identifying feature of this Kyros-Syros culture is the figurines, then what archaeologists have labeled Kyros-Syros really only corresponds to this Naxos Minor Cycladic region, and the presence on Kyros of a sort of sanctuary with mysterious ritual depositions and breakages, and the fact that the figurines were manufactured by these particular marble-rich islands surrounding it, confirms this intuition. Daskaleo-Kavos then seems to be this axis mundi of this Kyros culture and tradition. The material found here that can be traced back to Northwest Calandriani is very few. It shows that those Northwest groups were certainly involved, but in a lesser way. Perhaps it was just accessibility and distance that prevented them from playing a greater role in whatever took place here. Much of the issue lies in the way we compartmentalize the data. We are trained to recognize distinctions, to slice time into discrete periods, and assign precise labels to similar material groups. But in doing so, we obscure the deeper currents of transformation and diffusion that run across these imaginary boundaries. We speak of the Grotto Pylos man as if he were a static figure bound to a fixed repertoire of tools and forms, rather than a living participant in an unfolding and dynamic society. It is precisely where these distinctions blur that the weaknesses of our methodologies are laid bare, and as a result, there's a sort of psychological blind spot. Each new period is treated as a rupture with that which came before. No serious academic would ever argue that there is no continuity between Saliagos and Grotto Pylos, yet the framework we use to describe them makes this continuity difficult to truly see. Otherwise, what has just been shown would have been immediately obvious, because of course it would happen in this way. Civilization followed different rules in these distinct regions. The same man that built the fortification wall of Strophilos was not the same man who terraced the sides of the Daskaleo outcrop, and we must stop treating them like they are the same, because as will be seen in part 2, key details slip through the cracks. Important considerations related to the traditions of the peoples, the iconographic motifs and art, the religious sensibilities. Are these not what bring the past to life? Is it not through these elements that we understand ancient man's character, his cosmology, his world? We know from spindle whorls that they weaved. We know through cups that they drank, and we know from stone scrapers that they crafted. But we do not know what he saw when he gazed out beyond the Aegean horizon. We do not know what he experienced looking up into the vast expanse of the sky, or how he felt atop Mount Zas during high winds. We do not know what these sacred objects, the frying pan, the figurines, meant to his cosmology. We have identified at least 2 distinct groups that came into the Cyclades from different directions and at different times, but ultimately, their interactions and development created what archaeologists see as a Kyros-Syros culture, a pan-Cycladic consciousness, a unique artistic tradition of the figurines, and a sort of religious sanctuary on a small islet south of Naxos at Daskaleo-Kavos. And the final question is, well, so what? Can this interpretive framework actually lead to any significant understanding? That is what we will explore in the next video, because in part 2, we will stop the analysis from the outside and instead try and let the islanders speak for themselves.